Managing the Pandemic, an occasional series brought to you by the Dorothea Green Lecture Series at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow with the Green School, and want to welcome you to this latest series brought to you by FIU here in Miami. Today's session is part of a series of virtual seminars looking out at how various countries are handling the pandemic. Today's session features France and Germany, and joining us to discuss the situation is Andreas Siegel, Consul General, the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany here in Miami, and Laurent Galissot, Consul General, Consulate General of France, also here in Miami. My special thanks to both of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us here today for this session. After the virus broke out in China, Europe soon after became the epicenter of the crisis. Now, of course, it's here in the United States, but Europe is still reeling from the devastation wrought from COVID-19, both in terms of public health and in economic terms. Most countries are moving towards some form of easing of the restrictions, but the situation remains very serious. We thought looking at the situation in France and Germany was a useful way to gain insight into what's happening on the continent. So if I can, let me start with you, Laurent. If I could ask you to give us a sense of the situation in your country, the status of the epidemic, and what steps your government has taken to address it. And then we'll come to you, Andreas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for the initiative. And I'm very pleased to be with Andreas again, because we used to do things together, of course, as France and Germany. But on the issue of COVID-19, it's true Europe is still paying a high cost in lives and in the pandemic situation. In France, we have more than 25,000 deaths and a high plateau, let's say, of 140 people with COVID. So it's a very serious situation. We handle it with a lockdown, with confinement, as we said in France. And we plan, we see now that there's improvement in the circulation of the virus and in the health situation in general, with hospital and capacity to handle some serious cases. So we plan, and the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, set a date on next week, on Monday, indeed, to reopen gradually. He did for that a kind of a monitoring of the situation very locally by departments. You know, in France, we have a lot of different regions, and you know, since Napoleon, we have this way of structuring, which is small pieces, and it's striking how interesting it was for handling an epidemic, because it used to be the distance of traveling a journey by horse, you know, traveling by horse in the 19th century. And it has proved to be the right way of monitoring a population and to handle the circulation of the virus in a piece of territory. So depending on the color of this department, if it's red, it means that there's still a lot of cases and shortage sometime in hospital. If it's yellow, it's improving, or if it's green, which means that the criteria are reached. The reopening of France will be gradual. Perhaps just to add on this, the originality of the choice taken by President Macron and the government of France is to reopen schools, which has been done in Denmark, but very little until now. On the base that it's a very strong leverage as well for people to go back to work, because if there's no schools, people won't go to back to work. So we'll see, but there's a plan that will be announced by the end of the week for starting from 11th of May.
Wonderful, Laurent, thank you so much. Andreas, let's turn to you to get a sense of what's happening in Germany.
Well, fortunately, we're past the peak of the first wave, at least we can say. That was towards the end of March. Now we have the famous flattening curve with sort of decrease of the increase every day. And in Germany, we are talking about a reproduction rate, which means the rate of people who are risking to infect other people per day. And that is, and if that rate is 1, for example, it means every person who's infected will infect at least one other person as well. Now, the aim, of course, is to get below 1, so that not everyone infects anyone else. So in Germany, we are at the moment at a rate of 0.75, which means every 100 infected people will infect still 75 others. So it's still enough reason to be concerned, and that's why we're observing a discussion among experts and politicians in a federal system in Germany, where we have decentralized approaches as well. We had, or still have, the highest density of COVID-19 in the areas of Bavaria in the south. In North Rhine-Westphalia, that is where the Rhine Valley is, bordering the Netherlands and Belgium, and Baden-Württemberg, bordering Switzerland and France. That's where the highest incidence appeared, and that's also one of the reasons why in mid-March actually, it was decided by the Ministry of the Interior to close the borders, or to have very strict controls, which has caused a lot of difficulties, especially for those who are commuting cross-border. And as I am sort of a former coordinator of the German government of cross-border cooperation, this was one thing that I really didn't like about the developments in March, that people who were used to going to the other side, for example, of the Rhine, were hindered, and even those who worked on the other side were sometimes rejected. And it's only now that people become more cooperative and more sort of pragmatic in these areas. But fortunately, altogether, I think we are now nearing a point where Germany, France, and Switzerland and the surrounding areas are at a similar stage of flattening the curve, and that also opens more possibilities of cooperating and integrating measures together, and in particular now about opening the borders again, which of course will be also in a region which is very much dependent on these cross-border cooperations, will be very important also to relaunch the economy. I mean, in Germany, the efforts of testing have been launched very early, and that's why I think the effectiveness of keeping the figures down, in particular the death rate, which is now about 7,000, but which is way below most of the other comparable European nations. It's still a lot, but that is due also to a high availability of high intensive care units, to the fact that we had a pandemic expert who had developed a test very early, so that people could be tested already in February on a large scale with a lot of private labs. And that helped also for the tracing, because we had some isolated cases in Munich and in North Rhine-Westphalia, which helped to prevent the spread to a certain extent. But and then we had, of course, difficult, but then in the public perception of good communication by the politicians, in particular of Chancellor Merkel, who has sort of sought a way to create a sort of a sense of urgency in the beginning. and also now sort of leaving the space for the regions, etc., to find individual solutions for the opening, but still paying attention, sort of not to let the figures go up again.
Mhm.
So let me ask both of you. You mentioned, Andreas, that the death toll, while obviously still far too high and unacceptable, is very low per capita based on other comparisons in Europe. And Laurent, in France too, it is not as high and not as tragic as we have seen in Italy and Spain. Can both of you give us a sense of, while it's still very early in this crisis, it is not over, lessons learned, what has been most effective and what has worked the best? Because particularly as other countries, Russia, for example, right now are in the beginning stages of facing this crisis. Andreas, maybe start with you and then go to Laurent.
Well, one important thing is to have a pandemic strategy in place, that you know who is doing what in that kind of crisis. It is, of course, also one factor is how the health system in your country is working in general. And if you have a good working health system in Germany, I think we spend about 11% of GDP on health, which is above European average. That certainly helped also in the beginning with the situation of severe cases, so that we could also, for example, treat patients coming from other countries like France or Italy at certain moments. So availability of material, of course, you never know what kind of pandemic is going to come, so you cannot foresee everything. But definitely you need to talk and you need to involve all the important civil society actors and politicians in the dialogue on how to deal with this, in as far as closing and opening the economy is concerned. So communication and having a sort of reliable information environment is very important. So in Germany, for example, the epidemiologist who developed the test has now a daily podcast since March or since February even, which is extremely popular. Even people here in the United States are watching this, explaining sort of all kinds of details concerning this kind of pandemic. So you need also sort of reliable communication on the expert level, and of course a reasonable public discussion in politics as well.
Great, thanks. Laurent, how about you from France?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a kind of preparedness we had to face. Then, why there's more widespread COVID-19 in one country to another, it depends obviously of the health system, and Andreas is perfectly right on that. Measures, way of managing as well, taking decisions at local and having the means to engage. I mean, a proper strategy. There's geography as well, because France is in the center of Europe. A lot of people are traveling in France, crossing France. So it's true, we saw less cases in Eastern Europe, for example, because the connections are a bit different. New York in the States is very different than Oklahoma or other cities in the country. So there's geography, there's strategy, of course, there's health preparedness, there's testing, and Andreas is perfectly right. I mean, the sooner you test it, the better you can monitor the crisis. Then I think, I don't want to speak for Italy, but they had some strategy where everybody was going to the hospital, which was not the proper way of handling, because you infected already vulnerable people inside the hospital. So the way to get the protocol right took time, and everybody learned from the others. And now we see, for example, UK having it's an island, it's very different, but they didn't test really early, and now it's the most vulnerable country in I can't say EU, but in Europe. And so it differs a lot, sure.
So let me ask both of you how your populations have reacted to the way your government has handled this and the economic toll. Obviously, this is going to take a toll on every country around the world, on impact on trade, on GDP, and so on. But how have the populations responded? And are there pressures to get the economy back on track? Here in the United States, as you know, President Trump and a number of governors are moving toward reopening, and yet there are public opinion surveys that show strong support for keeping a number of the social distancing measures in place despite the push from the government leaders. What kind of pressures are your leaders facing in your respective countries? Maybe Andreas, will start with you.
Well, I think we have similar challenges than you have here in the United States. And the discussions also are sort of resembling each other, I would say. Of course, there's a big economic pressure to restart the economy, but the question is under which conditions and how do you do it in order to not sort of favor a new wave of pandemic. And well, there have been some back and forth of discussion, but altogether the measures, the stay-at-home measures, so have been widely accepted by the population in Germany, with some exceptions at certain gatherings here and there and so on. But there is obviously a growing pressure, and in particular, the politicians in the Länder and in the regions in Germany, who have also constitutional power to decide, a little bit similar to the governors here in relation to the federal government, or even more. So now, as we speak, there was a conference between the presidents of these Länder and the chancellor's office, where they agreed on sort of a differentiated approach to this, which is going to be left to the Länder, but also their responsibility to respect that if a certain level of reinfection occurs, that they would have to stop the process and go back again. I cannot but comment on one thing which struck me, or actually shocked me here in the United States. I'm thinking of the events that took place in Lansing in Michigan, at the state capitol. I mean, the measures decided by the governor may what they be, they can be debatable, but I was definitely shocked to see sort of armed militia type groups sort of present inside a key democratic institution, which I learned was not illegal, whereas it is illegal to carry signs and have sort of slogans written on it, or the slogans that you could read outside, like tyrants get the rope or things like that, are extremely disturbing to considering that the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly are really very important democratic rights, and they should not be associated with sort of threatening or arms-bearing gestures, which really have nothing to do, in my view, and I think it's widely shared in Europe, this view, that you have to strictly separate sort of these rights from other rights that you may have constitutionally.
I agree 100%, and I know the governor of Michigan expressed similar disgust with your views, Andreas, as well. And the polls, I will say, in the United States do not seem to back the small, albeit vocal minority that have turned out in a number of cities around the U.S. But Laurent, let me turn to you about the reaction of the population and the toll in economic terms.
So stay-at-home orders, I mean, it's you know, it's very serious because people I mean, experienced war, and this is something very disruptive. I mean, to be confined in a place and not being able to move, especially because French people love public transportation. So there's good side and bad side. For example, in France, you have the highest social safety net in Europe. So obviously, being at home, they had compensation. So you still earn something, and there has been matching for, I think, 80% of your revenue. So which made people, I mean, not happy, but able to stay at home with a certain kind of revenue. Then, as I mentioned, people love public transportation, and they depend very much on public transportation. So that was another element. Or, for example, they love to, the way of living as well, to do on a public marché or market in the street were completely impossible. So the way of living has changed very much for the people in France. I would say far more than in Florida. I mean, we're speaking to people, of your students and people around. I mean, the way of living of Floridians didn't change as dramatically. The living in France changed for French citizens. And for 2 months, I mean, that's a very long time. And it's very, so people are resilient in a sense. They're impatient as well to see way for the future. So France is the country of Pasteur, so they understand that a vaccine is not for tomorrow, but we have to rely on science. So our people are very rational on that. They do think it's a question of time, but we have to be cautious. And the idea to take decision on science and data-driven is very well accepted, I would say. And there's no kind of popular feeling that tomorrow there's a solution and you can really dismiss scientific truth. No, I think people do accept that this is a serious thing, there's an issue, but it has to be faced for recovering.
And I assume, getting back to what Andreas mentioned about what happened in Michigan, I assume neither Germany nor France has seen anything like these small but very vocal and very visible groups of protesters. Is that correct in neither country?
Well, at least not with this sort of violent character. Mm-hmm. There have been some small protests with very few people, actually. But everyone, I think, or most of the people understand that this has to be sort of a step-by-step process to reopen again.
Yeah, Laurent, go ahead.
Yeah, I think in France it's the same. I mean, people have to incorporate it and to be responsible. That's difficult the first weeks, and we still see the days before the reopening in a sense that people just are impatient. But there's no contestation that the measures were taken with results, and the people do follow instructions as such.
Great. So let me ask two more questions. One is a broader question about the EU, and then the last question is about the local situation that you've had to deal with here. And Andreas, maybe start with you about the EU, given the imminent presidency of it for your country. How does this affect the priorities? How does this affect the handling of the EU? Brexit, some have talked about, should be put off in light of this. And closed borders has driven up a sense of nationalism in some places. Give us a sense, if you would, of how your country's approaching this.
Well, I think this is, of course, Corona has changed the sort of the whole context of working mechanisms and also of the planning schedule of what are the priorities. As you know, Germany is approaching the presidency of the European Union in the second half year. And the original ideas of promoting, in particular, climate change and many other and important topics have now been refocused, obviously, by the lack also of physical possibilities to hold these meetings. And you don't have just the ministerial meetings, you have working groups, numerous hundreds of working groups which prepare the ministerial meetings. So all this has to be done by video conferencing. These lines are not yet done really to function sort of in various places or simultaneously in a secured way. So there's a lot of improvisation at the moment going on. And well, the key issues for the next months are, of course, to get the European economy floating again. There have been already a number of decisions by several European institutions, including the European Central Bank, the European Investment Bank, and the European Council, and also a recent this Monday, past Monday, there was a global response conference organized by the European Commission, which raised like $8 billion of funds, also in the with the idea of having a common approach to research and of manufacturing of treatment for the crisis.
And I regret to say the United States was not there, but anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Did not participate in this group. There were other non-European countries participating, but unfortunately, the United States didn't. But if I just return a little bit to the European agenda or the EU agenda, of course, we still have the Brexit, which is causing a lot of sort of problems in terms of timing, because the sort of the Brexit talks are supposed to end on the 31st of December, unless the UK is sort of asking for a prolongation of these talks. And as usually these kind of new relationship treaty negotiations last, from experience, 2 or 3 years and not 1 year, and this one is even more complicated. I think all the remaining EU members would like to have some kind of flexibility and extending this, because there is a high risk of running into a hard Brexit again if so if there is no agreement on a number of issues, which currently, as we stand, will be the case, because there are numerous issues where there is disagreement. So there is a possibility to extend these negotiations until end of June. So now, until end of June, we have still sort of time to think, to reframe this discussion and maybe to extend it. At the same time, we have not yet a European agreement of the remaining EU 27 about the 7-year budget, the next 7-year budget, which was not, there was no agreement on that beforehand. Now this has a completely new dimension, obviously, with the Corona crisis and the fact that the contribution by the UK has to be compensated. So these will be 2 key areas where the German presidency will have all hands full to try to find solutions to this, simply to stay operational and to keep the European integration together. I think there have been good signs now in the past weeks that really solidarity is working more and more again. And but we have a number of challenges which are really, really difficult.
Great, thanks, Laurent. The perspective of France.
Yeah, I mean, for the year, the crisis is always, you know, the big, there's a crisis every 6 months, more or less, and every 6 months we just say the EU has to overcome or die. You know, it's always a dramatic choice and so on. But I think all the countries are in a dramatic and a very serious situation. It's true, and I really like what Andreas said. Solidarity in the EU is very much at stake, but has shown some really good things, because even on transborder, for example, France has a lot of neighbors, Luxembourg, Germany, Swiss, and Italy, Spain, and so on. And there have been some cooperation, health, hospital to help people. And this is, even if Schengen has been restricted because of the circulation of the virus, there still have been some cooperation, territorial cooperation, especially on the east side of France, because this is a very affected part of France, and we had very good cooperation with Germany. So we didn't, in the European mind, we don't want you heal people from one side of the border to another. On the contrary, we arrange things to make on availability of hospital things matching needs and supplies. I think the agenda is about, health is not a competence for the European Union. So we had to face that this is not something where, because it's very different and it's internal, a little bit like in the US, it's at the state level, it's not at the federal state, at the federal level. But we still have this thinking about strategic supplies, or for example, for masks or for ventilators, or for really things that Europe has to count on its own. And I think that's a thinking that will develop further. How do you make it strategically proved, and you have the right stocks for very sensitive, we talk about treatments, pills, and other things made in China. Why it's done in China and not anymore in the EU? What kind of treatment you should keep as essential for the EU as such? So I think that's a very interesting way in thinking. Unity is another one. I mean, we're talking about solidarity. I think it's still in the spirit of EU. It hasn't died, as everybody would, predict that, EU has no more solidarity. I think that hasn't been the case at all. Unity for a country is very important, and for France, for example, to keep really the people together, because in this type of crisis, obviously, everybody can say, I don't care, I manage my way. And so it's not just possible. So this kind of building unity and really assure that people can be have the services around that would help them to face this kind of threat, and very big threat on their health. So yeah, I think perhaps the other thing I would highlight is because we see in tracking and in how you can stop the spreading of the virus is to track the people, and it's all the issue of rights. So what's right, and how can you do that with respect of individual rights and civil rights? And that's something interesting because we saw, unfortunately, that there's restriction. Well, we saw it in China, we saw it in a lot of countries, that in face of this kind of really big threat, some way of approaching the problem to restrain any civil rights, any individual rights, and that's something to take seriously.
Let me, in wrapping up this conversation, let me bring it back to the Miami area, if I can, and ask both of you. I think both of your consulates, you yourselves and your teams, were quite consumed with the issue of cruises and people who were stuck on the cruise lines, and then helping them get off the lines and repatriate back. Could you maybe just give us a quick summary of how you had to deal with that. That was obviously a crisis that I don't think you anticipated much before, but one that really consumed most of your time for the past couple of weeks. Laurent, maybe start with you.
Yeah, on cruise line, obviously, we saw the risk coming from Japan, for example. If you remember, there was a Princess ship there. And Miami is the capital of cruise lines. And we were, all together, because we had discussion, we are already a bit worried before the outbreak that no preventive measure, really sound preventive measure were taken by the companies. They just say, okay, we don't board people with a Chinese passport. Well, what does it mean for a virus to have a passport? It's not that. So what kind of check do you do and so on? And it's true, the protocol were not in place. And, cruise industry is very representative of a big globalization market. The cruise is coming from Asia most of the time, or from Latin America, and they board and they come back. And passengers are mostly North American, but not only, a lot of Asian and European as well are boarding. So we had to face the outbreak with no really guidelines from the cruise line industry. And that was very worried, and we were a little bit upset because it was very difficult to get information, and most of the time we were as well, that was very unusual, making broker between CDC and the cruise line themselves, because everybody stands on his own prerogative. And so at the end of the day, we managed for the European passenger, and especially with Germany for flight back, we had different stops in Paris and Frankfurt, and that was very, very good cooperation, even broader with Canada, UK, and so on. We are very all together on this issue, but I do think that the model of the cruise industry is as really to be reshaped in light of this outburst, because they can't not restart exactly the same way.
Great, thanks. And Andreas, the view from your consulate.
Well, I was equally involved in these negotiation processes, and indeed, our concern was to bring our citizens back and to do this under sort of to get this sort of underway. It was necessary to mobilize, and I think I rather underestimate more than 1,000 people altogether who were involved in this repatriation process. So it's an enormous effort. Of course, the main responsibility is, or has been, with the cruise lines, and they're still working on repatriating crew, as you're reading in the press. And I know that conferences and telephone conferences are still underway with many consular colleagues who have crew on board or on ships. So it is a very complex situation, and I think there has to be some lessons learned from this. From our side, Consular Corps, I think we have gained in cooperation. We had a WhatsApp group where we have worked together very quickly, so we could react very much and flexibly to different situations at all times, 24/7. And then, of course, the communication with the local authorities was sometimes difficult. But then were not just the local authorities, but many other also national authorities who were involved in this process. So we could only sort of tackle a certain angle of this from here. So our embassies in Washington had to be involved, and our capital sometimes. So it was a very complex process. And looking at the importance of the cruise industry here in Florida, I think definitely it has to be reinvented somehow. And the precautions which have to be taken and the conditions of travel, maybe losing some of its attractive aspects, will have to be reviewed.
Great. Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Laurent Galasso, the Consul General for the French Consulate here in Miami, Andreas Siegel, the Consul General for the German Consulate, also here in Miami. I'm grateful to both of you for really a very enlightening and fascinating discussion. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to do this and to join us here today. This has been Managing the Pandemic, The View from France and Germany, an occasional series brought to you by the Dorothea Green Lecture Series at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs here in Miami. I'm David Kramer. Thanks very much for joining us and hope to see you next time.
Thank you, David. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas.